Hi everyone, my name is Haddon, and I'm delighted today to welcome Professor Gavin, who is the Attenborough Chair in Drama here at Sussex. He describes his work as transdisciplinary, working across the intersecting fields of performance studies, queer studies and visual culture. And his talk today is titled We're All in This Together, Reflections on the Post-Punk Artist Group.
This is very much work in progress, so I'm hoping you can help me push it to the next level. So, I'm very receptive to suggestions for development. I hope to finally get around to writing the book that will come out of this research next academic year. I'll jump straight into it. There are three parts to the paper. The first part is pretty autobiographical and short. Then there's a middle part, which is basically the main part of the paper. And then, if I get time, there's an extremely short coda at the end. So, let's begin. Part 1, Class Acts. The Three Johns were one of my favourite bands in the mid-1980s. Hailing from Leeds, this late-period post-punk outfit held my teenage imagination because they made beatbox-driven Gang of Four-esque music with lyrics that, as a burgeoning young Marxist, I really got lost in. Oh, There's a Son of Mud, sings vocalist John Hyatt on their 1984 album, Atom Drum Bop. Oh, the future is rising, yes, it's rising, not a stone's throw from today. Growing up as I did in the stultifying small-town culture of the English East Midlands, this was heady stuff. The idea of being on the cusp of something big, something historical even, and that the future was all to play for, was electrifying. The almost Bataillon image of a son of mud was at the same time troubling. It was something I couldn't quite work out and seemed ominous. It left me with the creeping dread of a future whose brightness might be obscured, as the sun might be blotted out, let's say, by a radioactive plume, or as a kind of weird, gloomy brightness in which you might get bogged down or stuck. I was slowly waking up to what was happening under Thatcherism, because it felt proximate to me. I remember being stopped by police during the 1984-85 miners' strike, when they mistook my friends and I for flying pickets driving to the Nottinghamshire coalfields. We were actually going shopping. Listening to the Three Johns helped cast such realities in a broader imaginative landscape, which, as a 16-year-old boy from a working-class family, I excitedly inhabited. My head was full of the political fictions etched out in Hyatt's sometimes opaque and absurd, other times more directly political lyrics. Oh, the mob expects malnutrition, Hyatt's caterwauling continues in the song. Robots are guarding that old ribcage fashion. Flaming torches, pickaxe handles, looking down the water cannon of pop music, before then going on to the chorus, rock and roll, rock and roll, rock and roll is an ideological product. And then the further line, rock and roll is pop music for the credit card hospital. I really loved the irony of these lines. The Johnnies were holding up their sullied hands, signalling how the capitalist entertainment business could be treacherous and betray the intentions of even the most ardent lefty rockers. These lines also chimed with my own take on the mainstream 80s pop industry, which, by this time, I'd largely tired of as glossy capitalist distraction. I really appreciated all this, even if, frankly, I didn't quite understand what ideology was at the time, and it was to be another 3 years before I would read Adorno and Horkheimer's famed take on the culture industry. But I wasn't drawn to the Three Johns solely because of their avowed political stance, nor even because I simply liked jumping around to their music, usually while drunk. They loomed large for me then because I also knew, from reading The NME, the New Musical Express, that 2 of the Three Johns went to art school. The art connection was also unmistakably present in the band's cover art, which featured paintings by Hyatt, drawings by John Langford, and work by the post-conceptual British artist Terry Atkinson, which you can see a piece by here. Atkinson was a former member of the British conceptual art group Art and Language. Atkinson was then teaching in the Fine Art Studios at the University of Leeds, where Hyatt and Langford had been his students. Therefore, the band also represented to me the world-making possibilities of being at art school for someone who at the time was producing highly realistic oil paintings of scrapyards or still lifes of gardening implements for my art A-level. Rather than more of the same then, the three Johns represented what might be possible at art school for someone like me, a future in which I might make art out of popular music, and one committed to leftist ideals of social and economic transformation. I share these personal reflections of teenagerdom with you, not because I want to be self-indulgent or nostalgic, but because on becoming a member of the Professoriate a few years ago, I have been thinking about the higher education system which allowed me to get to where I am now, and the contrast between it and the transformed marketised conditions of English HE since the introduction of high undergraduate fees in 2012. Art school education, along with access to higher education more broadly, was fully state-funded in the UK from 1962 until 1989. As a result of the post-war social democratic consensus, which dominated matters of state until Margaret Thatcher's government began to unpick it in the 80s, I, alongside others like me, was able to go on to higher education without any hesitation about its affordability. There were no fees to pay, I received a full local authority maintenance grant, I claimed housing benefit to cover my rent, and even claimed the dole during the summer holidays. The considerable financial barriers that have been thrown up for working class kids considering higher education more recently only seem to be getting higher as student loan repayments are already turning out to be more expensive than was originally touted by George Osborne and his cronies. Of course, this new system of financing has been devised to pay for a system that has vastly expanded participation since the 1980s. But, as Valerie Walkerdine perceptively puts it in her own take on these issues, quote, "One of the paradoxes of the current situation in Britain is that while there have never been more places in higher education, it has become more and more exclusive." Unquote. Bearing witness to this very fact, a report published only this year by the Higher Education Policy Institute identifies disadvantaged white boys as the least likely class of person to go to a university today in the UK, the class I would likely have been positioned in by any comparable study back then in the mid-1980s. Given all of this, the post-punk years which I am currently researching, look like they are set in the midst of a halcyon and somewhat short-lived period of free education in the UK. I fear we are in danger of losing something that fueled the production of much post-punk art and music, and indeed some of the most radical and experimental art production in the UK in the latter half of the 20th century, namely the mingling of people from different social classes within our HE sector. In her extremely useful and provocative essay on collaboration and late 20th century art and performance practices, the writer and theatre maker Claire MacDonald notes that working class participation in the arts can be understood as a key driver for, quote, creating new directions for interdisciplinary art, but also of breaking down stifling boundaries of class and tradition at the heart of British culture, unquote. Tracing a genealogy of collaborative work across the boundaries of dance, theatre, fine art, poetry and music from the 1960s onwards, and including the work of the Bradford Art College Theatre Group, Scratch Orchestra, People Show, Welfare State International and John Bull Puncture Repair Kit, amongst others, she notes that such ensembles and collectives were given particular impetus to experiment in the ways that they did, quote, through the expansion of UK higher education and the rapid dissemination of ideas and images through television, unquote. With information made more readily available than hitherto through democratised access to education and through the steady rise in ownership of TVs, closed forms of elite culture were thus pressurised to open up to their various outsides. This was particularly so, she suggests, during what we might call the long 70s, between the street protests of 1968 and the crushing of the miners' strike in 1985. For example, the work of Albert Hunt, along with his Bradford Art College theatre group, was largely disrespectful of established theatre traditions by drawing freely from popular cultural sources and in its use of non-professional actors. Originally hailing from a working-class background in Burnley, Lancashire, Hunt helped create works like John Ford's Cuban Missile Crisis in 1971, which drew on Ford's cowboy films to manifest a theatrical treatment of the Cuban Missiles Crisis, all performed by students studying visual rather than theatre arts. Something of these early 70s cultural experiments is preserved and extended into the latter part of that decade and into the early 80s by a generation fired up by the DIY anti-establishment example of punk rock. This was a generation eager to embrace similar cross-fertilizations to those practiced by Hunt and Company, especially to explore the possibilities of avant-garde artistic experiment transposed to the terrain of popular music making. This was a creative possibility fed, as I've said, at least in part, by the example of punk. Part 2, Groups in Common. The Three Johns were part of a remarkable and somewhat overlooked creative scene in Leeds in the late 70s and early 80s. The book I'm writing is an unapologetically regionalist study of post-punk in this city. We can talk a little bit about some of the scholarly post-punk literatures and how Leeds is a footnote at best in most. Nick Crossley's book on the kind of sociological take on post-punk networks is just one example amongst many. The roll call of bands that came out of the city at this time is impressive and varied, including the Mekons, Gang of Four, Delta 5, Scritti Politti, the Sheehees, Another Colour, Sheeny and the Goys, Johnny Jumps the Bandwagon, Severed Head and the Neckfuckers, no picture, Pink Peg Slacks, Smart Cookies, and electronic acts like Fad Gadget, and perhaps the biggest success story to come out of Leeds, although you could argue it was Scritti, at least in mainstream terms, Soft Cell. Many of the key members in such bands were fine art students at this time, and as such were exposed to the pedagogies of conceptual and performance art at Leeds Polytechnic, which is now Leeds Beckett, where members of various performance art and collectives taught. Jeff Nuttall from People Show was a key member of staff on the fine art staff at the Polytechnic, alongside John Fox from Welfare State International, John Darling from the John Bull Puncture Repair Kit, and performance artists like Shirley Cameron and Roland Miller. They were all teaching at the Poly. And students who went to the university were treated to the teaching of Marxist, feminist, and post-structural theory, largely at the hands of Terry Atkinson, the artist who I've already mentioned, and social historians and feminist historians of art Griselda Pollock and T.J. Clark. T.J. Clark took over as chair of the department in 1976 when Lawrence Gowing left. And just as important to those specific pedagogies which were at play in Leeds Polytechnic and Leeds University, for the story I'm going to be telling you, was the Anarchy Tour, which pitched up at Leeds Polytechnic in December 1976. For many would-be band members, this now legendary punk gig was the first opportunity to see the Damned and the Clash play live, and also, and perhaps most importantly, of course, the Sex Pistols. Many bands including Gang of Four, Scritti Politti and Mekons, formed immediately after the transformative experience of being at this gig. As Simon Reynolds details in his book Rip It Up and Start It Again, one of the few studies to pay serious attention to Leeds post-punk, there soon emerged a militant, that's his word, and highly inventive music scene in the city, especially around the university bands, steeped as they were in Marxist and feminist theorising. Punk had provided the rage and the impetus, but it was up to the bands that came after to trace new musical directions that might escape the prison house of rock. Gang of Four and Scritti Politti were perhaps most path-breaking in this regard, with their deconstructed approach to producing rock music structures, whilst Soft Cell and Fad Gadget took cues from Kraftwerk in developing a more futuristic electronic sound. By the way, I should say at this point that somewhat unusually for me in presenting this material, I'm not going to talk much about musical form or aesthetic form today. That, if you like, I'm not going to talk much about the actual results of this generation's artistic and musical experimentation. That's because I want to foreground instead the conditions which made it all possible. Okay? The educational, institutional, and organizational conditions that helped shape it. One of the first things to note then is that post-punk musical experiment, or at least that portion of it emanating from art school, was fueled by a generation of working and lower middle class entrants to it who were able to attend for free. This was particularly true of the fine art course at Leeds Polytechnic, which had a preponderance of such students, but even the university had a working class student intake, albeit smaller in size. John Hyatt, lead singer of the Three Johns, the son of a school cook and a lorry driver, was one of the latter, going to the university to study fine art in 1977. His class background imparted a desire within him to make art that would reach beyond the confines of the bourgeois art world. You can see why, he has subsequently reflected, rock and roll music would come out of the tube if you squirted it. The immersion then of lower class students in a middle class art world and the exposure of middle class students to those from backgrounds unlike their own formed the cross-class bedrock of this period of art school experimentation. Some 2 decades after the publication of Richard Hoggart's Uses of Literacy, it brought working-class life-world experiences into art school culture and spawned a generation of art students unafraid of carrying popular tastes and working-class politics into, and sometimes against, the confines of the elitist, gallery-bound world. Echoing my opening reflections on the Three Johns, many former Leeds students from the time remember their love of pop music and pop culture as their route into art and art school, rather than, let's say, any specialist knowledge or interest in gallery art per se. Green Gartside, swoon if you will, of Scritti Politti, for example, ventures that it was his interest in the Beatles and by extension Yoko Ono and the 1960s counterculture, which made him initially gravitate towards visual art. Coming from a working-class Tory household in Wales with no books in the house, he did not otherwise have the cultural capital he needed to get into art school. Others that went to Leeds later, after the first wave of post-punk bands had broken there, like Jackie Callis, who went on to play in bands Another Colour and Delta 5, did so because they were excited primarily by its music scene and wanted to be in bands themselves. The positive value attributed to pop music in pre-art school years persisted into the lives of students once there, as band members like Callis attempted to garner institutional recognition for their music making as part of their degree work, as part of their fine art degree. Some submitted album cover art for their studio assessment. Kevin Lysette of the Mekons did this at the university, whilst others, like Callis, presented wall texts incorporating long-winded justifications for why their band's musical output should be construed as a valued practice by their tutors. Andy Wood, also a member of Another Colour and fine art student at the Polytechnic around 1980, made this the gambit of his final degree show that also included art and language style attacks on art school management. He got a lower second-class degree for his provocation, as did Kevin Lysette and a number of others. Hugo Burnham, Gang of Four, was an English student at the university at this time, and he also presented a portfolio of his Gang of Four work for his final assessment and graduated with a 2-2. Though such attempts to challenge the limits of the, if you like, the art enclosure with pop and rock music were met with consternation by some tutors, they were nevertheless, in many ways, continuous with the kind of cultural engagement that Leeds art schools solicited from students at this time. The Polytechnic in particular was renowned for being one of the only art colleges in the country where you didn't have to specialise in, e.g. painting or sculpture, and had new facilities for filmmaking, sound recording and performance practice. There was what they called a theatre space, which was basically a black box performance space, and there was also a small sound recording studio. In a way now typical of the post-conceptual British art school, but completely unusual in Britain in the 70s, students were encouraged to be led by ideas rather than by some slavish dedication to a particular technique or practice. This meant that they were invited to work across technical skills and media in transdisciplinary ways, across an open field of creative possibilities, perhaps almost literalized in the overview of multifarious activity afforded by the mezzanine level of the Poly's huge hangar studio, which you see in this image. This also excited many students interested in doing something out of the artistic ordinary. Many were attracted, for example, by the prospect of doing performance art. Leeds was renowned as an unusual art college at this time, as a place where you could go to do performance art. And it seemed outrageous and oftentimes newsworthy at Leeds in the 1970s. This is a news report in the Daily Express of a particularly infamous performance by Derek Wayne and Peter Parkin, which involved, at least according to some testimonials, the shooting of live budgerigars. They got fined in court, and there was a big fisticuffs after the event apparently, and they got beat up by members of the audience. That was the kind of thing that went on in Leeds in those years. Students who were interested in getting into bands and making music at art school then were not, strictly speaking, authorised to do so, but they were encouraged to experiment in relatively unrestricted ways, which could, of course, potentially include setting up a pop or rock band. And when they did make music, it's important to recognise that because of the peculiar nature of this pedagogy and the multiple creative pathways on offer, they were often not exclusively focused upon it to the detriment of everything else. Frank Tovey, who became later the electronic music pioneer Fad Gadget, Frank Tovey, for example, a fan of David Bowie and Lindsay Kemp, upon arriving in Leeds, would perform mime and put on theatre adaptations of unsung novels like Anne Quinn's Berg, which you see the production poster of here. And there's another shot, a studio shot of him in his outfit for playing Nathan within that adaptation. So he put on mime and put on theatre adaptations of unsung novels alongside making sound and music, firstly with his short-lived band Fans, which include actually Mark Armand, and later as Fad Gadget. Mark Armand himself, from Soft Cell of course, made performance art, appearing in films by his peers, and with another fellow student, Dave Ball, made sound work that would eventually lead to the music of Soft Cell. Green Gartside did conceptual style imagery and occasionally performance, but he was as much a theorist as he was an artist or musician. his reading of Derrida and Gramsci as formative to the direction of his work as listening to the Beatles or Henry Cow. Even at the university, fine arts student Steve Schill, who we see here on the left, for example, who was a one-time guitarist for Sheeny and the Goys, he was also involved with the experimental theatre cooperative Impact, which also counted Hugo Burnham, soon to be drummer for the Gang of Four, as one of its founding members. Such widespread disciplinary bed-hopping then between performance work, theatre work, artwork, and music making, I think demonstrates how these artists weren't afraid of working across different practices in collaboration with others, borrowing ideas or effects from one field and transposing them onto another. Now, this insight goes right to the heart of the argument of my book project. Which foregrounds, the book foregrounds the particular relational conditions, the social and disciplinary conditions for the emergence of post-punk expression. Now, I'm very aware that much work has been done within music scholarship, particularly within the sociology of music, to explore various similar or related forms of relationality, usually support structures of one kind or another, either in Andy Bennett's work on music scenes, or in Peter Webb's work on milieus, or in Nick Crossley's work on networks. But I'm not going to be really drawing upon their work here, and that's not, and that's in part because I've been theorizing this, conceptualizing this through a different register, through a different theoretical register. I've opted instead to concentrate my energies in thinking about post-punk as a kind of commons, as a cultural commons, and to think rather specifically, along with that, about the band or the group as a significant collective unit within it. A commons, in part, because one of the rather under-recognized things I think about post-punk is that it was about something rather more than just the music, or just music alone, and instead was a moment in which an orientation towards the experimental possibilities of culture as an open field was expressly developed or marked. Ideas of the commons take us back to the old English idea of a commons as a legally recognized communal resource, often agricultural, which has communal access rights, rights of use, etc., which is open to all commoners, for example, to graze their livestock or to use as a resource for pleasure walks or relaxation. Crucially, for my purposes here, the history of the commons is also a history of attempts to encroach upon it, to enclose it as private property, land grabs, if you like, to literally fence off areas of previously held common land for private exclusive use. To prevent this from happening, of course, commoners had legal rights to tear down such encroachments on annual perambulations on and around common land, during which commoners would beat back the bounds of such private enclosures and encroachments onto common ground. Now, this idea of the commons then, it's obviously something which we still have contemporary commons. Clapham Common and Tooting Bec Common are only the most immediate examples. But, laws around the commons are still being utilised in disputes around the gentrification of the urban environment. I mean, the skate park on the South Bank, as I understand it, was saved by a legal argument being marshalled that it was a commons. And so it was kind of defended on those grounds against the encroaching possible gentrification and shops and all the rest of it that a developer wanted to build there. So this idea of the commons as an open field, free from demarcations and enclosures, is obviously something I'm using in a rather metaphoric way in relation to this, to think about, if you like, the full breadth and width of the cultural continuum as a kind of field, which disciplinary specialisms, perhaps, and especially latterly, in studying this moment, attempt to enclose in various ways, privatising and making exclusive the right of use or access therein. In many ways then, post-punk culture, as I see it, was about resisting those enclosures that threatened to encroach upon creative practice. It was a practice of commoning. It was about challenging the limitations and enclosures erected on the cultural field. And in terms of the way post-punk has been studied, I can see that in terms of the disciplinary specialisms of the scholarships that's brought to bear upon it, because it tends to be that music scholars kind of, if you like, enclose the avowedly musical productions and study those in the context of broader histories of musical developments and musical style. Theatre and performance historians tend to take inevitably the theatre and performance, while art historians break out the kind of visual arts practice. And what's lost in those kind of disciplinary enclosures is a story of this kind of open, experimental, short-lived mind, post-punk commons, that I'm interested in trying to give account for. So the broader book includes not only accounts of some of the various bands that I've already identified, but experimental theatre and performance work that was done by Impact Theatre and others, Hesitate and Demonstrate, but theatre and performance work that was undertaken by some of the members of some of the music bands. And indeed, I pay attention to some of the stage styles as well, let's say of Fad Gadget and Soft Cell in particular. And I will come to a moment to also talk about photography, since this is a media, film, and music school. I could talk more about the band and how I'm thinking about the band as a particular kind of collective and as a kind of informal collective. At this time, at least how it was understood very differently to how other creative collectives might be understood, i.e. less hierarchical, at least in this first flush of activity in the wake of punk in '76. So less like the theatre company, for example, with its hierarchies of director and writer and whatnot. But maybe we'll talk about that after, because that will take me down a slightly different route, and I don't think I've really got time to go into that. I was going to talk a little bit about Scritti Politti and post-rock, but maybe I'll play you aesthetics later. But as I say, I want to concentrate more upon the conditions of possibility that made this post-punk commons possible, and then we can talk about specific instances later. But being in a band after punk seemed to promise expansive possibilities for its members, not just in terms of broadening one's artistic scope beyond, say, easel painting, nor even in terms of exiting the art world for a career as a rock or pop musician, although, of course, a number of them did indeed go on to do this. Scritti Politti, Green Gartside, Soft Cell were highly successful in the mainstream music industry. In an interview with Peter Anderson, however, for a feature article in The Enemy in 1984, one of the three Johns outlines the importance of if like another possibility that being in a band held for members of this generation. The three Johns outlined the importance of solidarity in realizing the political rather than the artistic possibilities of being in a band at the time. Quote, There are an awful lot of bands who separate themselves from each other, who aren't aligned, and they're just out to put themselves ahead, out for whatever they can get. And it's a good example of 1980s Britain. Those groups can't be anti-establishment because, to me, they are the establishment. Because pop is so fragmented, it's made itself impotent as far as political power is concerned. Millions of bands and artists, each interested in their own career, instead of any kind of movement, unquote. Firstly, a problem then. Many bands had given up the post-punk ghost by this time, 1984, and had turned to capitalise their previously independent ventures within the shiny Thatcherite pop industry. The Sheffield band ABC are probably the best example of this, and Andy Beckett writes very well, I think, about this kind of turn towards the Thatcherite pop industry it's in Promised You a Miracle, his 80 to 82 book about that period in British history. The antidote to selling out in this way, the Johnnies suggest, is movement politics, like those practiced successfully, albeit only for a short period of time, by Rock Against Racism, for example, in the late 70s. Here, reggae and punk bands came together on the same bill, bringing their respective audiences together in a unique musical body politic attempting to fight racism and prejudice. So, yeah, there we go. By the time of the NME interview in 1984, however, Rock Against Racism was long gone. The Three Johns, along with fellow left-committed bands, were attempting to rediscover something of Rock Against Racism's political reach in playing miners' benefit gigs, affiliating themselves with and directly supporting the striking miners in their set-piece confrontation with the British state. But even given this seemingly propitious state for political involvement, John Hyatt concludes the interview, rather forlornly it seems, by saying, quote, "It would be good if something did spring up, i.e. some kind of movement, but personally, I can't see it happening," unquote. Which is where perhaps we begin to glimpse the utopian cast of some of the youthful dreams of social transformation given expression by band membership at this time, about the hoped for but never fully realised forms of political communion and engagement to which the Leeds scene helped give birth. Bearing in mind what I've been saying thus far about the importance of an inclusive student body, at least in respect of social class, my reference to Rock Against Racism should remind us that this inclusiveness did not extend very far at all to non-white UK students, let alone international students, because we are, of course, looking at a period in HE just before the globalisation of capital would heavily impact upon university recruitment patterns. The people who did hail from British immigrant families and went to study art at Leeds at this time, some of whom have gone on to have successful individual art careers, like Shaila Kumari Berman and Sutapa Biswas, were in a tiny minority amongst their white peers. This dramatises how, even despite this being a period of free access to higher education, cultural factors were operative in preventing greater numbers of non-white students from applying to art college. Indeed, as Christy Adair points out in her study of the British Afro-Caribbean Phoenix Dance Company, also hailing from Leeds at this time, it was familial culture, in this case the place of reggae and carnival in immigrant Jamaican households in East Leeds, that provided the cultural habitus for the emergence of Phoenix Dance's own brand of experimental group creation. Art school wasn't the place to go to follow up on a cultural schooling in dance, and reggae bands weren't exactly streaming out of British art schools like post-punk bands were at this time. Of course, elsewhere in the UK, early 80s art schools did see collectivist artistic endeavours pursuing groundbreaking questions of black identity and history, with the Black Art Group from Wolverhampton and the emergence of the Black Audio Film Collective at Portsmouth. But it's just that in Leeds, no comparable collective was to develop at this time. But it is perhaps with women participants in the Leeds scene that we might best appreciate what we might call the stinted nature of the peculiar brand of the cultural commons that we associate with post-punk. In terms of music, there were a small number of all-female or almost all-female bands in Leeds, notably the comedy band The Sheehees and Funksters Delta 5, and numerous bands had strong female presences. But men generally dominated the scene. Jacquie Fleming, a student of fine art at the university and a member of the Sheehees, recalls that forming the band might have been some kind of feminist response to all the male bands that were springing up, and was about puncturing the seriousness and self-importance of the machismo of studio culture. It was, first and foremost, therefore, an initiative not of killjoy feminism, but of a joyful and wryly humorous skewering of male pretension and pomposity. Dressed in Elizabethan gowns, fags hanging out of mouths, and comedy glasses with eyeballs on wires, they performed hilariously bad cover versions of Lionel Richie's Hello and Bobby Vinton's To Know You Is To Love You, plus self-penned numbers like Worms Have Infested My Knickers. Even so, everyday life for women in West Yorkshire at this time was no laughing matter. Feminist politics developed particularly strongly across Leeds around the late 70s and early 80s, partly as a reaction to the very real fears for women's safety on the streets as a result of attacks by Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. And within the art school context, sexual harassment was a more or less everyday hazard in the studio. Things came to a head by the mid-80s when a group of women attacked a ceramics exhibit at the Polytechnic Gallery on the grounds that it was offensive and degrading to women, and recently graduating Polytechnic students in 1984 accused male staff of favouring female students that they were suspected of being in relationships with in the assessment of degree show work. This turned into the so-called Sex for Degrees scandal, which achieved local press coverage, as you can see here on the right, in the Yorkshire Evening Post and elsewhere. Set against this backdrop, the last Leeds artist group that I want to consider today, albeit not a musical group, was established in 1981. The Pavilion Group was a feminist curatorial collective dedicated to supporting women's photography practice locally and nationally, and was largely made up of former fine art students from the university and the Polytechnic in Leeds. The work of this group stands as totem, I think, of some of the real potentialities of working in common with others, as well as indication of some of the intractable problems that cluster around the politics of the common cause at this time, especially when faced with the politics of gender. Taking its name from a disused cricket pavilion on Woodhouse Moor, which they got from Leeds City Council for a peppercorn rent, which was subsequently, they subsequently turned the pavilion into a working dark room, gallery, and project space. But the group did this themselves. The space was run along thoroughly collectivist lines. Its roots lay in workers' education authority classes on feminist art history that some of its members, notably Shirley Moreno, had been teaching in the run-up to and during the first few years of the group's existence. Pavilion was therefore readily able to reach out to everyday women beyond the art world, just as post-punk bands were trying to touch more popular audiences with their music. But the difference here was that Pavilion invited such women to participate in the project as producers of culture, not as consumers, or not solely as consumers. Women, for example, from inner city areas like Hare Hills or Chapeltown were furnished with the means of photographic production in the venue's project spaces that enabled them to make their own representations of their lives and to have those images publicly exhibited. Such representations were otherwise completely absent from the mainstream gallery system. This was, of course, a very different time from today, where almost anyone can access the means of photographic and video production on their smartphones. Photography kit in those days, on the other hand, was cumbersome and expensive. Inviting communities of women into the pavilion in this way then meant that the organising group was perpetually aligning itself with and facilitating the political and representational needs of other women and of activist and other artist organisations like the Hackney Flashers in London. Because in addition to showing work in the gallery space produced by women locally, it took touring shows generated from other feminist and photography bodies across the country. As with many a collective, there were tensions between different political priorities, between those who wanted to see it run more as a space for experimental feminist art and those who favoured its role as a women's social centre. But this awkward mix is also what arguably gave the pavilion its exceptional political character, by bringing everyday life worlds and avant-garde experiment together in a socially diverse network of activity. The social space of the Pavilion Group as an avowedly feminist space is, of course, radically unlike some of the other social spaces occupied by the music groups I've been speaking about so far. Though not strictly speaking a women-only space, men were welcome as visitors to the exhibitions at Pavilion. There were specific events closed for women-only attendance, and the collective was exclusively made up of women members, at least as it wore on. John Tagg was involved a little bit in the beginning. Thus it might seem odd to begin to close my a lecture entitled We're All in This Together, with its overtones of political commonality and inclusiveness, with a project in which feminist separatist energies were present, if not necessarily totalising or decisive. But I want to insist on this awkward endpoint as talisman for the problematic politics of the common. Let the pavilion mark both the customarily unmarked masculinist and therefore exclusionary nature of the social spaces occupied by many of the bands I've been reflecting upon throughout, while simultaneously also allowing us to soar up into the sky, as it were, enjoying the vantage point of this group of super-feminist Rodchenkos high above it all. And then just a little coda. I'm known as a scholar in contemporary queer studies, and so if you know my work, you might think it's rather odd that I've not said anything thus far, or very little, about issues of queerness. And as I've been undertaking this research, I have been haunted by what Jose, the late queer scholar Jose Esteban Munoz wrote recently, when he wrote, "Queerness is not yet here." And I've been thinking about that as I've been doing the interviews. I've done many interviews for this project, around 50, taken around 50 oral histories so far, and doing the archive and all the rest of it. And there does seem to be rather little in terms of kind of expressly kind of queer work. I mean, certainly I'm going to be looking at the work of Fad Gadget and Mark Harmon and Soft Cell and Dave Ball and that kind of coterie around them, because certainly there were kind of queer issues being explored through the theatricality of stage styles and whatnot within that context. But thinking very specifically in relation to the importance of lesbian feminism to feminism in Leeds, as I was looking through the archive in the Feminist Archives North of the Pavilion, I came across these photographs. In the very early years, before this must be around 80, 81, maybe 82, not sure yet, before the space is really established and transformed by the group. And there's these. And these. and these. And so I think, wow, an early example of a kind of piece of performance art exploring a queer wedding. So I wanted to know more about this, so I wrote to a number of people who were involved at the time. One of them, Sarah Worrell, who was a member of the group, and she wrote back the following: "Women of my political generation, gay or straight, had no ambitions to get married. I don't think anybody at this time, 81, 82, was really thinking about gay marriage. Activist women were not thinking about getting married to anybody. Elton John was married to a woman and George Michael gave his heart to a girl at Christmas 1984. W.H. Smith's refused to stock gay news. You could only buy it at the Student Union, and this was before the AIDS crisis. In Leeds, the lesbian activists were mostly part of the radical feminist group. They were separatist, and some people were political lesbians, of course. They were involved in learning how to be car mechanics and plumbers at East Leeds Women's Workshop and throwing bricks through gallery and sex shop windows. They would not have been involved in anything so poncy as performance art." I loved that testimonial for two reasons. Firstly, because it's a reminder of how archival research can be jarring with contemporary political mores, and certainly the kind of embedded homonormativity around the politics of gay marriage is something that this era firmly sets its face against. But also, this is a testimonial about class as well. It's about those lesbian car mechanics and plumbers who aren't really or are problematically related to this post-punk commons that I'm setting out. So I'm interested in thinking actually about Fred Moten's idea of an undercommons, of a kind of mass intellectuality of the broader populace, away from kind of professionalized walks of life, and thinking about the relationship between the post-punk commons and that. But that would be another talk for another evening. So that's it. I'll thank you for your attention. Thanks.